The Parshas Vayikra talks about the Korbanos, very well-structured parsha, and it's impossible to discuss Korbanos in all their detail. I'd like to spend a little time talking about Korbanos in general. And I believe a number of years ago we discussed the sheet of the Rambam regarding Korbanos. The Ramban quotes the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim that says that the purpose of Korbanos is to refute the opinions of the nations that surrounded the Jews. We know the Egyptians worshipped sheep, other nations worshipped cattle. So in order to demonstrate our rejection of those false beliefs, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us that we should slaughter these animals and burn them, and this shows that we reject the deification of domesticated animals. This is the opinion of the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim. The Ramban asks three basic questions in the Rambam. Number one, he says, it comes out that Shulchan Hashem Megoyal, that the table of Hashem is really being made disgusting by the Rambam's approach, because according to the Rambam, the whole idea of the Korbanos is to refute the nonsensical opinions of the Tipshim, of the fools. How is it possible that that's what the abode of the Beis Hamikdash is all about? That's the first question. The second question he asks is that, in fact, the slaughtering of animals does not refute those false ideologies. Because it's true that in those nations they did not eat lamb or beef because they deified sheep and cattle, but in fact they did bring them as sacrifices. That in Egypt, where they worshipped the sheep, they did slaughter the sheep to the deity. And in the other countries who worshipped cattle, they slaughtered cattle to the deity. So our slaughtering sheep and cattle can't be a refutation of those false systems, because even within those systems, they slaughtered sheep and cattle to their deities. That's the second question of the Ramban. The third question the Ramban asks is that this would explain why we bring Korbanos after Avodah Zarah became widespread. But how do you explain the earliest Korbanos in the Torah? For example, the Korbanos of Cain and Hevel. At that point in time, there was no Avodah Zarah yet. So what were they bringing sacrifices? The whole purpose of the sacrifice is to refute, to negate the false beliefs of the idolaters. What sense did the sacrifices make when, at the very beginning of time, Cain and Hevel brought Korbanos? In fact, according to Chazal, even Adam HaRishon brought Korbanos. So what sense would that make? These are the three basic questions that the Ramban asks on the Rambam. Now, in the past, we quoted the Ritva wrote a sefer called the Sefer HaZikaron, where he comments on all the places that the Ramban, in his commentary to Chumash, disagrees with the Rambam. And he addresses this particular issue by pointing out that the Ramban does not quote everything the Rambam had to say on this subject. That in fact, in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam speaks about Korbanos in two different places. In the third chelik, in the third section of the Moreh Nevuchim, in chapter 32 and in chapter 46. And the Ramban only quotes the second part, the words of the Rambam in chapter 46. He doesn't quote what the Rambam said earlier in chapter 32. And there, the Rambam says something else, which is very interesting. He says like this. He says that it's the wisdom of the Ribono Shel Olam, that the Ribono Shel Olam does not expect that people should change radically overnight. The Ribono Shel Olam allows us the space and the time to change gradually. The Rambam gives illustrations of this, but one of the interesting ones is that it says in the Pasuk that when the Jews came out of Mitzrayim, it says, Lo nacham Elokim derech eretz Plishtim ki karafu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not take them through the land of Plishtim, which would have been the shorter route to Eretz Yisrael, unless they be frightened when they would see war, and they would decide to turn back to Mitzrayim. So the Rambam explains Because you have a nation that not long before was enslaved and they were very much suppressed, and now all of a sudden they find themselves in a situation where they're called upon to demonstrate tremendous courage and face adversaries. It's not going to happen. So the Rebbeinu Shem understood that therefore they had to be given a time to recuperate, if you will, to build themselves up to the point that they could face the challenges of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. And that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu took them the roundabout way to Eretz Yisrael. So the Rambam says this is an illustration of the wisdom of the Ribono Shel Olam. He understands human nature and doesn't expect people to change immediately. So it says the Rambam like this, that really korbanos should not have been permitted. The service of the Ribono Shel Olam should have been through tefillah, through prayer, through the observance of mitzvahs. Really, there should not have been korbanos. But at that time, everyone worshipped their deities with korbanos. So for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to say, okay, from now on, no korbanos, abandon what you're accustomed to. From now on, you're going to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu with prayers, you're going to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu by doing mitzvahs, but there are not going to be any rituals, no sacrifices, and so on and so forth. This would have been impossible for the people to do. How do you give up something which you're so accustomed to for so long and so many years in al regal achas, so to speak, on one foot? So therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a concession and allowed the Jews to continue bringing korbanos. Now, the Ritva seems to understand that if we take these words of the Rambam into account, all the Ramban's objections fall away. The truth is, to the contrary, it seems this interpretation of the Rambam is even more difficult than the other one. Because the other one recognizes that there is some positive value to korbanos, albeit to refute the false opinions of the Avodah Zarah. But this approach of the Rambam seems to be saying that korbanos have no value at all. It's only a concession. Because the Rambam says, listen, I can't have you stop cold turkey, so I'll let you continue bringing korbanos for a while. So if anything, it seems to make the question much more difficult. So we explained many years ago that the interpretation of the Rambam is as follows. Of course, the Rambam agrees that korbanos have positive value. Nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would not have commanded us to bring to korbanos. He wouldn't even have allowed us to bring korbanos, because the idea of the korban can be easily corrupted. In other words, if it's brought with the proper intention, then it's fine. But if it's brought with an improper intention, then it becomes something which is abhorrent, and the mistake is one that's easily made. And therefore, the Rambam says that in an ideal world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have said, forget korbanos. In theory, they have value, but the idea is so easily corrupted, it's not worth taking the chance. So in theory, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have said, no korbanos. Why didn't he say that? He didn't say that because it would have been very hard for the Jews to be weaned away from korbanos. And the Rambam himself seems to say this. The Rambam explains that's why we find that all mitzvahs generally applies throughout the world. And there are no restrictions on mitzvahs. The mitzvah of tzitzis, the mitzvah of tefillin, applies in Eretz Yisrael, applies in Chutz La'aretz, and so on and so forth. When it comes to korbanos, there are restrictions placed on it, many restrictions. It's only in the Beis HaMikdash, only in Yerushalayim, only performed by Kohanim. There are many, many limits that are placed on the of korbanos. And that, the Rambam says, is a reflection of the fact that it isn't an ideal. It isn't an ideal. So, on the one hand, yes, it has positive value. On the other hand, it's easily corrupted. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu permitted it as a concession, but he placed limits upon it. But once we acknowledge that it has some positive value, at least some of the questions of the Ramban fall away. The first question of the Ramban asked, that it comes out, the Shulchan Hashem L'Goyel, the table of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is made revolting, because we're bringing korbanos only to refute the nonsensical positions of the Tipshim. According to what the Rambam says over here, that's not true. The korbanos have positive value. It might not have been the ideal, but they do have some positive value, and that's why korbanos are acceptable. The last question that the Ramban asks, how do we understand the korbanos of Cain and Hevel? Also, whatever the positive content of Korbanos is, that undoubtedly was the intention of Cain and Hevel. The middle question, however, seems to remain difficult. In other words, the Rambam does say that the reason we bring these specific animals is to refute the opinions of the Avodah Zarah. Now, the Ritva explains that there shouldn't be a contradiction in the Rambam. The Rambam is really telling us two things. The reason for Korbanos generally is, as we said, it's a concession to the past. Why HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to bring the Korbanos specifically from cattle and sheep is in order to reject the deification of cattle and sheep. But again, the question is, how does that work? I mean, this objection seems to be unanswerable. That if the worshippers of cattle and sheep themselves slaughtered cattle and sheep to their deities, how could our slaughter of cattle and sheep be a refutation to that system? So that question seems not to be answered. But there's also another question we have to ask ourselves. We'll put those questions in the back burner, but let's ask ourselves the basic question. What is the idea of Korbanos? And in what way is it corrupted, or corruptible, that I should say that if not for the concession to human nature and the difficulty of giving up the past, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wouldn't have allowed it. Where can a person go wrong in the bringing of Korbanos? So 4 years ago when we talked about this issue, we talked about the idea that really the Rambam lays down as a fundamental of faith the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has no physical substance and form. He's removed from everything that is tangible. And therefore, the idea of Korbanos, giving him something which is an object, something which is edible, meat, wine, etc., flour, this is something which is inconsistent with our theological conception of God as being removed from material existence and experience. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu permits it as a metaphor of sorts. As we're allowed to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the same way that we can speak of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's body parts. Because Dibra Torah Kalashim Nayadam, HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows us to worship him that way. But it's an idea which is easily corrupted, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu would not have allowed it if not for the fact that it would be hard for us to give it up. That's the approach we took a number of years ago, and I think that is 100% correct. But I'd like to discuss another possibility as to what the idea of Korbanos is and how it is easily corrupted. And maybe it will give us a key to answer the question we left with, which is, how does the bringing of Korbanos of these specific species demonstrate a rejection of the deification of those species in light of the fact that their worshippers did slaughter sheep and cattle to their respective gods? It seems pashut, if you scan the Mefarshim, that the fundamental sacrifice is really human sacrifice. The sacrifice of animals is a replacement for the sacrifice of the human being. And this is understood on many different levels. The Ramban understands that the sacrifice of an animal is a vicarious self-execution. In other words, we are declaring before God that as punishment for my sins, really I should deserve to be slaughtered and burnt. So vicariously through the animal, I execute myself as a punishment for my various sins. That's the approach which the Ramban seems to take. The Sfas Emes, we quoted in the past, understands that it's a vicarious self-sacrifice of a different sort. It's a demonstration of my willingness to do anything that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would ask of me. It's a total self-negation to the will of God. I declare before God whatever you would want, whatever you would ask, I'd be ready to do it, even if it meant slaughtering myself, making the ultimate sacrifice. I'd be willing to do that because your will is so important to me. So it's not so much a vicarious execution as a vicarious self-sacrifice, a hisbatlus, a self-negation to the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom. I would do anything you ask. And that's why, of course, the idea of a korban on the part of a person who does not do the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu when it comes to mitzvahs is, of course, preposterous. Because the whole meaning of the korban is the demonstration of my willingness to do whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks for me. How is it possible that I could be in violation of God's mitzvahs and yet bring a carbon? What meaning could that carbon have? And if you remember from the Haftarah of Parsha Zohar, this is really the issue. That there was a mitzvah that Shaul HaMelech was given to wipe out the Zecher of Amalek. It meant obliterating the animals as well. And the people spared the animals to bring karbonos. And that was the critique of Shmuel. Hinei Shmuel mizevach toiv. It's better to listen than to bring karbonos. Meaning, because the whole purpose of karbonos is the symbolic self-sacrifice to the will of God. What meaning could a carbon have if at the same time I'm in violation of God's explicit command by sparing the karbonos, sparing the animals that should have been slaughtered? The truth is that Rabbeinu Yonah really alludes to this. There's a sefer Rabbeinu Yonah wrote, not a well-known sefer, called Shari Avoda, where he talks about the avodah of karbonos, the avodah of tefillah, and he writes here that when a person would bring a carbon, that's exactly what he would say. He would say, "V'chein b'shah sheyishachtanas karbanon lefanov," when a person's animal sacrifice to be slaughtered, hayeroya shchitaso, he would see the shchita kilu hu atzma nishchal, as if he himself was slaughtered, and he would say that Ribono Shel Olam, let it be considered as if I was slaughtered. As it is revealed before you, if this was your will, I would have done it. It should be considered as if I did it. This idea that I'm willing to do anything for you. This is the idea of the carbon. That means that the essential carbon is the self-sacrifice, the human sacrifice. The animal is a symbolic replacement. In the past years we've talked about this idea. This is why the Medrash Rabbah says in this week's Parsha that every time we bring a carbon, it's reminiscent of the Akedah. And what's the connection to the Akedah? Because that's exactly what the Akedah was. The Akedah was really meant to be a human sacrifice. The Ayil replaced the human being. So every carbon that we ever bring is really based on the paradigm of the Akedah, where the animal is a tumura, is a replacement for the human being. And that's why, of course, the Rambam tells us, Al Pi Chazal, that the site of the Mizbeach in Yerushalayim, of course, was the site of the Akedah. This very spot where the Akedah took place, this is where we bring korbanos. There's another way of looking at human sacrifice. And let's look at human sacrifice as perhaps the Ummah Sha'olam may have looked at it. There's a parsha in the Torah, Parsha Darchei, the parsha of Molech. And Molech was a ritual where people took their children and they passed them through fire and burnt them to Molech. Now, there's a little bit of a confusion among the Mefarshim, but the Ramban proves there in Parshat Darchei through many, many proofs that the children did not survive the ritual. The children were burnt to death in the process of performing the Molech. Now, there's a machlokas in the Gemara, in Sanhedrin and Samach Daled, whether Molech is Avodah Zarah, or whether Molech is not Avodah Zarah. Now, the Ramban explains that one of the various deities in the pantheon of that time was Milkaim. Milkaim was the deity of Ammon. And that's what the Molech was. So if Molech is Avodah Zarah, it's a reference to that particular deity that was worshipped in this way. And the question is, why does the Torah have an entire parsha of Molech? We know every Avodah Zarah is forbidden. Every Avodah Zarah is the Chi of Misa, every Avodah Zarah is the Chi of Karas. Why should the Torah single out this particular deity, Molech, Milkaim, worshipping it this way? This is the way it was conventionally worshipped. So the Gemara says, if you hold that Molech is Avodah Zarah, you're right. The Torah really didn't have to tell it to me. I would have known on my own that if you worship Molech in this way, you're Chayav Misa and Karas. Why did the Torah write it? Tell me a chidush. That even if you worship a different deity with this same ritual, you're also chayav misa. Now, normally it's not the rule. Normally the rule is that you're only liable for avodah zarah if you worship the avodah zarah kedarka, if you worship the avodah zarah the way it normally is worshipped. So if Moilech is worshipped by passing children through fire, for that you're chayav. But if you worship Baal Peor or Markulis or one of the other avodah zarahs in that way, really you should be pucker. So therefore the Torah wrote the entire parsha of Molech to tell me that this ritual is so important that it makes no difference to whom you direct it. Whether you direct it to the actual Molech or you worship some other deity in the same way, either way you're chayav karas. This is according to the opinion that Molech is avodah zarah. According to the opinion Molech is not avodah zarah, the Gemara says, I wouldn't have known that you're chayav. It's not avodah zarah, so I wouldn't have known you're chayav misa or karas. So therefore, that's why the Torah had to write the parasha, and therefore, be'emes, you're only chayav misa if you perform this ritual with connection to Molech. But if you perform it in connection with some other deity, you're be'emes not chayav, and I need the Torah to write it because I would have thought you're not chayav, because it's not an avodah zarah, it's not an act of worship. So the question is, if it's not an act of worship, what is it? What is the tzad of the Gemara? What is that possibility the Gemara is entertaining that Molech is not avodah zarah? So the Ramban says in Parshas Achimos that according to the opinion of Molech is not avodah zarah, it's a form of kishuv, it's a form of divination, a way of fortune telling. It's not really an act of worship, and therefore that's why I would have thought you're not chayav misa, kamash malan. That's why the Torah tells me you're chayav misa and karas, even though it's not an act of worship. That's what the Ramban explains. So we have two opinions. Rav Hirsch, in his commentary to Chumash, says an amazing pshat in the opinion that Molech is not avodah zarah. An amazing pshat. Not like the Ramban, different pshat. It says like this. He says that there were people who believed that there's something called fate. Fatalism. That means that the Bria, the universe, is structured in such a way that there is a glass ceiling, if you will. There's a maximum amount of success that a person can achieve in life. There's a maximum amount of money you can make. There's a maximum number of children you can have. There's a maximum amount of satisfaction you can have. And if you approach that glass ceiling, that's it. You can't go beyond that. You can't have more than that. What if a person has stepped over the line? What if he's been blessed with too much success, too much money, too many children, too much bounty? Then sooner or later he's going to lose the extra. He's going to lose the surplus. Because that is the idea of fate. It's not a question of a divine punishment. It's not that you've done anything wrong. But there's a maximum. There's an upper limit to what a person can enjoy in this world. And perhaps temporarily you can go a little bit overboard, but sooner or later it'll catch up with you and you're going to lose it. That's the belief of the people in fate, fatalism. Says Rav Hirsch, that's what Molech was. Molech lav avodah zarah is because to be considered avodah zarah, it has to be the worship of a personal God, meaning a God who relates to us as a person does, with whom we can communicate, who can take notice, etc. The worship of an impersonal force is not avodah zarah. If a person will bring a carbon to justice, to love, to energy, that's not avodah zarah. That's not a being. It's not a person that can relate, can respond, can react to what you do. With avodah zarah, the crime of avodah zarah is predicated on relating to a deity as a person. To do something directed towards an impersonal force is not technically avodah zarah. So what is the purpose? What are you hoping to accomplish? So the idea is that you're giving back something to the forces of fate in the hope that you'll be able to retain the rest. I'm surrendering the extra to the force of fate so that I can keep the remnant. Now, Rav Hirsch proves this from an amazing halacha. The pasuk says if a person gives mizaro lemolech, if he gives of his children to Molech, he's liable for misa and karas. And the Gemara says, miktzah zaro v'lo kol zaro. You're only liable if you give some of your children. But if you give all your children to Molech, you wouldn't be liable. So the question is, should be a kal v'chaymer. If you're liable for giving one of your children or some of your children, certainly you should be liable for giving all of your children. So first is no, because if you give all your children, you're missing the point entirely. The whole point of Molech is I'm surrendering something to that fate in order to keep the remnant. If I give everything away, that's not what Molech is, not the essence of Molech. It's an amazing, amazing pshat. But let's step back for a moment. Now, what if Molech is avodah zarah? Then how do you understand that? Now, it happens to be the Rosh understands that the maskana, the conclusion of the Gemara, is that we rule the Molech not avodah zarah. But let's say for a moment Molech is avodah zarah. How do you understand that peculiar halacha? That if you give all your children, you're not liable. Give some of your children, you are liable. The idea is like this, that it really is the same thing. Let's say Molech is avodah zarah. There is a deity called Molech, which is a personal god. It can react and respond to that which I do. But it's the same idea. Its motivation, what that god is interested in, is the suffering of human beings. In other words, that god is jealous or resentful of the success and happiness of human beings. There's an adversarial relationship between the deity and man. And therefore you have to pay off the god. How do you pay off the god? Give him some of your children. This way, hopefully you can spare the rest. The shaila, whether Molech is avodah zarah or not avodah zarah, is, are we directing this sacrifice of some of the children to the impersonal force of fate, that impersonal glass ceiling which doesn't allow me to have unbounded success and happiness? Or is it to a personal deity who doesn't allow me or want me to have an abundance of success or happiness? But that's a detail which is not relevant to what we're going to talk about tonight. But there is this conception that there is a deity which is at odds with human beings. That this is not a deity that loves us and therefore we love in return. It's a deity who sees us as competitors, who is jealous of our happiness, who we have to appease, and we appease by making sacrifices in the hope that if we give him one child, maybe he'll spare the rest. It would seem that's a totally different conception of human sacrifice. The conception of human sacrifice that we have, of which the Akedah is the paradigm, is the idea of the love we have for the Ribono Shel Olam, the devotion we have to his will, our willingness to do anything because we recognize that his will is of supreme importance. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, would never ask us to make that type of sacrifice because he loves us, and therefore he allows us to bring the animal as a substitution. And there's different concepts of human sacrifice, which is the idea that we have an adversarial relationship with the deity, and we have to bribe him, pay him off, appease him somehow. We'll give him one child, hopefully he'll spare the rest. Maybe even an animal will be good enough. I don't have to give him even a child. I can give him a cow. I can give him a sheep. But the idea is, I'm paying him off. I'm bribing him. I'm appeasing him in order to be able to continue my life in a happy way. Two different conceptions of the human sacrifice and two different conceptions of what the substitution of the animal for the human being would be. Right? For the Jew, the animal is symbolic of the self-sacrifice, the devotion to the will of a deity who loves us and cares for us and wants what's best for us. And to the pagan, it is a payment, it is a bribe to be able to hold on desperately for what I already have. I'm willing to even sacrifice one of my children, and hopefully I can get away even with an animal. This difference between the Jewish attitude and the pagan attitude maybe can be brought out in a very interesting halacha. There's a Gemara in Masechet Zvachim which says that the carbon shlomim, one of the types of karbanos mentioned in our parsha, the carbon shlomim, only Jews could bring. B'nei Nayach, Gentiles could not bring the carbon shlomim, only the carbon ola. And the Gemara learns this from an interesting pasuk in Shir Hashirim. It says in the pasuk, Uri Tzafain, arouse yourself, O north, Uvoi Taimon, and come south. So what is this a reference to? Now we know it like this, that the carbon ola there was a special halacha that the Karban Ola was slaughtered only on the north side of the Mizbeach. And the Karban Shlomim could be slaughtered anywhere, even on the south side of the Mizbeach. So when HaKadosh Baruch Hu heralds the coming of the redemption, and the Gentile nations that occupy Eretz Yisrael, it's time for them to leave, and time for the Jews to return, Hashem says, Uri Tzafayim, meaning arouse yourself, peoples of the north, people whose sacrifices are only slaughtered on the north, because they only can bring the Karban Ola, Uvoi Taiman, let the Jews return, who are special because they can bring sacrifices that are slaughtered on the south, which is the Karban Shlomim. So this is the basis of this halacha. The Bnei Nayach can bring a Karban Ola, but not a Karban Shlomim. Jews can bring a Karban Shlomim as well. What's the difference? Of course, the Karban Ola is something which is burnt totally to the Rebbeinu Shalom. A Karban Shlomim is a shared meal. In other words, the animal is slaughtered, a portion is eaten on the Mizbeach, is consumed by the Mizbeach, and the portion is eaten by the person bringing the carbon. The Gemara says in Maseches Beitza that part that the Jew eats is Mishulchan Gevaya Kazachu. He earns it from the divine table. Meaning he's not giving half an animal to God and keeping half an animal for himself. He's giving the whole animal to God, but the part that he eats is from the divine table. That's what the Gemara says. Meaning we are sharing a meal with the Rebbeinu Shalom. The Maral says in the Chidushei Agados, Maseches Zvachim, that's the difference. The Benayach can give something to the deity. That he can understand. The Karban Ola, where I take the entire animal and I give it to God, that a Benayach can understand. That a Benayach has a connection to. But the idea of something which is shared, that we share a meal with God, which is the Karban Shlomim, that is only for Yisrael. Only Yisrael has that relationship. Why? Because to the Ummah Ha'olam, the deity is an adversary. So you might buy him off, you might appease him, you'll give him a Karban Ola, you'll give him something which is totally burnt to him. But the idea of sharing a meal with him, the idea of comradeship, of brotherhood, of friendship, that is something which the Benayach cannot relate to at all. So that's a defining characteristic of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are called Boi Teiman. You who slaughter your sacrifices in the south, come. Meaning that you have a relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom, that you're not adversaries, but you are friends. You work together and you care about each other. That's the idea of Karban Shlom. That's something which is milchad for Yisrael. The Rosh on this halacha makes a very interesting comment. That if we talk about the symbolism of north versus south, this we all know that north is the one direction where there's no sunlight. Because the sun rises in the east, it travels towards the south, and turns around and sets in the west. In the summer, it rises in the northwest and sets in the northwest. In the winter, days are shorter, it rises in the southeast, sets in the southwest. But the sun does not travel along the north. Right? The word Safain is Miloshin Safun. It's hidden. That's the one side on which the sun is hidden. Darom is from Dar Rom. This is the height of the sun. Right? Many people don't realize this, but at high noon, the sun is not directly overhead. The sun is due south. If you stand and you face due south, the sun will be at its highest point ahead of you. Not over your head, but it'll be ahead of you at the extreme south. That's Doron. That's Doron. That's when the sun is on high. So south is the side which is illuminated by the sunlight. Safon is the dark side. The idea is like this, that to the Ummah Ha'olam, right, they relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the dark side. Right? To them, the deity is the one who is antagonistic to them. This is the force of darkness. This is the source of their suffering, and so on and so forth. You appease him. You bring sacrifices, and you pay him off. So to us, the Rebbeinu Shalom is Daraim, that the height of religious experience is when we bask in the golden sunlight of the Rebbeinu Shalom's bounty. That's the idea of the Karban Shlomim. That's the idea of Daro. So Uri Tzafay, the time comes, Hashem says, you who bring your sacrifices on the north, it's time to leave, and you bring your sacrifice from the south, this is the time for you to come. Now, these are the two different aspects of human sacrifice, and as we said, animal sacrifice is only a tumor, it's only a substitute for the human sacrifice. So perhaps this is another aspect of what the Rambam tells us, that of course korbanos have tremendous meaning. As we said, it's really if I carry a self-sacrifice, it's a demonstration of devotion to the Ribono Shel Olam. It's a very, very beautiful thing, a very powerful thing. And that's why we yearn for its restoration in Yemos HaMashiach. But it's an idea which is easily corrupted. In what way? It's easily corrupted because a person who misunderstands the idea of korbanos understands that what we're doing is that we're buying off a God who is antagonistic to us, a God who is opposed to us, a God who takes pleasure in our misfortune, and therefore we have to kind of appease him. Why should I have such a ritual? Just serve me by doing mitzvahs, serve me with tefillah. Right? Why should I prescribe a ritual which lends itself to such misunderstanding? So that the Rambam says there's a special reason. There's a special reason. Why? Because it's very, very hard to wean people away from something which you're accustomed to. And therefore, God said, okay, as a concession, I'll let you have it. Now, the question we can ask, we've asked before is, so l'chora, there's one question which no one asks, which is, well, if the whole idea of korbanos was a concession to human nature, because of the difficulty of weaning us away from it, so why is it part of the divine scheme that in Yemos HaMashiach, korbanos will be restored? I mean, we've had 2,000 years of golus and no korbanos. So now we're already used to the idea of no korbanos. Right? So, okay, so if the whole idea of korbanos is because it's difficult to give them up, okay, now, for whatever reason, we've given them up. Okay, it's been through golus and through churban, but now we're already used to the idea of not bringing korbanos. So why are we hoping for the restoration of Yemos HaMashiach? I think some mistakenly say that the Rambam holds that there won't be korbanos in Yemos HaMashiach. Of course, chas v'shalom, such a thing shouldn't be said. This is something which is basic to anyone who understands the Rambam, that the eternity of Torah is one of the 13 fundamentals of the faith, and if you throw out korbanos, you're not throwing out one or two mitzvahs, you're throwing out dozens and dozens of mitzvahs, or tayag mitzvahs. It's obvious that korbanos will be restored. We know our tefillas are all based on this assumption. So what's the answer? The answer is like this. But if the whole reason that the Baruch Hu made this concession is because of the likelihood of error, in Yemos HaMashiach, where there is no error, because then it'll be Mola Haaretz De'es Hashem, everyone will understand the truth then, there's nothing to fear. In other words, the Rambam who says that korbanos was a concession to human nature, but really God wouldn't have allowed it, is only going in the pre-Messianic age, before the Yemos HaMashiach, where the likelihood of error is great. So there, HaKadosh Baruch Hu would not have commanded korbanos, except for the fact that it's difficult to give it up. In Yemos HaMashiach, where the possibility of error is zero, then obviously korbanos will be brought with the proper intention. Right? The korbanos will be pleasing for the Ribono Shel Olam. There's no reason not to have them. So the whole discussion of the Rambam is, why did the Torah command us to bring korbanos before the Messianic age? But once the Mashiach comes, there's no need for an explanation. It's poshut that then the korbanos will be brought with the proper intention. There could be that this will explain the very curious fact that we mentioned that the Umas HaOlam, at the same time they deified cattle and sheep, slaughtered cattle and sheep. The Ramban pointed this out. So we said it can't be that our slaughtering of cattle and sheep somehow is a refutation to those false systems, because even the worshippers of the cattle and sheep slaughtered cattle and sheep as sacrifices. But that really raises the question, how do you understand that? I mean, if you're worshiping cattle, you're worshiping sheep, what is the idea of slaughtering cattle and sheep? All the explanations you can give, and I'm sure they have complex theological explanations to justify how slaughtering the sheep is in fact a worship of the sheep. But how does that come about? It happens to be that this question was raised, believe it or not, by Freud. And he pointed out that there's a phenomenon called ambivalence, which is there's hate and love directed to people at the same time. Now that phenomenon is not a chiddush that we all understand. Sometimes the people we love the most, sometimes we are the angriest with. But he says there's an idea of ambivalence. And he says, and this is why the pagans, he writes, in their rituals, they slaughtered the being that they deified. On the one hand, they were devoted to it. Maybe they even loved it. But on the other hand, they were so filled with resentment that they concocted rituals where they slaughtered it at the same time. And this is a demonstration of ambivalence that they had, the mixture of love and hate towards the object of their deification. Why did they have this mixed feeling? We understand, right? On the one hand, the deity provides them with everything. Everything that they have, all their successes and all their wealth and all their bounty comes from the deity. On the other hand, that deity itself is resentful of their success to the extent that they have to appease it by surrendering some of it in order to keep the rest. In other words, it's like a parent who gives you everything, and on the other hand, the parent is jealous of the fact that you have so much, and you have to pay off the parent. So there's the mixture of love and the mixture of hate. So therefore, it's to be expected that the ritual will involve the deification of a being, and at the same time, the worship of that being will involve the slaughter of the being. In other words, that's symbolic of this ambivalence that the Avdei Kachavim had to their deities. So at the same time they worship the cow, they slaughter the cow. At the same time they worship the sheep, they slaughter the sheep. And that's a commonplace. For a Yid, there's no such thing. Right? If a Yid was to deify the sheep, he would never dream of slaughtering the sheep. Because the very conception to a Yid of what it means to have a deity is a being who is concerned for my welfare, who loves me, who is concerned for me. The idea that I should worship a sheep and slaughter at the same time is total nonsense. It's unimaginable. So therefore, it's true that a casual observer who would see a Jew slaughtering a cow would not see this as a refutation of the alien belief system. Because it's true that the Egyptians who worship sheep also slaughtered sheep, and the Hindus who worship cows also slaughtered cows. So you see a Jew slaughtering a sheep, slaughtering a cow, you don't realize that it's a refutation. But for the Jew, coming from the Jewish perspective, the way he sees things, this is a very, very strong affirmation of my rejection of the cow and the sheep. If I deified the sheep, I would not slaughter the sheep. If I deified the cow, I wouldn't slaughter the cow. So what am I doing slaughtering the cow, slaughtering the sheep? I don't deify them. So it's true that the Ummah Sa'olam would not see this as a rejection, but from our perspective, our understanding of what a deity is, right, for us to slaughter the sheep, slaughter the cow, that is an absolute rejection of the deification of those animals. And therefore that, the Rambam says, that is the idea. That's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mitzavet, bin korbanos, specifically from cattle, sheep, and goats, because those were the animals that were deified. Our bringing them of korbanos, with our understanding, is actually a rejection of those beliefs. But the main thing is this, that really there are two different aspects of human sacrifice. There is the aspect of the pagans, which is the bribing of the god, the appeasement of the god, by giving something to the god so that I should be spared. And there's the Jewish conception of human sacrifice, which is the idea of total hisbatlus to the will of the Ribono Shel Olam. And the animal, of course, is a substitute. And the truth is, we don't have the basic English as that. We have tefillas, we have prayer. But prayer is essentially the same thing. Because what is the essence of tefillah? The essence of tefillah is the total hisbatlus to the Ratzon Hashem. In other words, it's the total declaration of my loyalty, my dependence on the Ribono Shel Olam, and therefore the tefillah itself is a replacement of korbanos. And according to the Rambam, it in a way is even higher than korbanos, because it doesn't lend itself to corruption. So as korbanos in the pre-messianic age have the danger, tefillah is incorruptible, because as much as that it's words, it obviously always has the true meaning contained in them of total self-negation and self-sacrifice to the Ratzon Hashem.